give me the possibility to have this lecture about risk management in martial arts. It doesn't mean modern historical martial arts. I'm not here to speak what does the Federation about management in this kind of situation of risk. I will discuss about what have been first identified as a risk during medieval time to early Renaissance. Secondly, what are the risks that have been what are the damage on the what have been constaté? Voilà, my English is constaté. Observed. Sorry. Then what have been observed. This is the very first small part of the lecture, and secondly, what have been done to mitigate or to manage the risk at that time. We should first consider that there is no possibility to do any statistics or that kind of things. It's actually really difficult for the Federation to do statistics on that kind of, on risk, on damage, on injuries. Then you go figure that for that period, we mainly depend on data which are not, we are not enough mentions of injuries, not enough mentions, and no possibility to do any kind of proportions. Then it's just to go to look at what happens, what have been kept in archives, in literature, in some narratives, and then to discuss the subject. Then you have here an engraving showing the King of France who are suffering a large pain after receiving a part of a spear in the eyes during a tournament in Armor. And it's about 1559, something like that. And he died a few days after this event, which is then probably one of the biggest deaths in martial arts during that time. And it's also to show that risk exists. This is not a debate. And which is not also a debate, is people at that time have some strategy to manage to this kind of situation. However, then death is mainly the main things that have been recorded for the practice in martial arts. We have no things, nobody who tells us that, you see, you have a knee which is twist. Nobody speaks about that. Nobody speaks about the nowadays, the usual injuries we could suffer today. We are mostly dealing about really deathly situation that where people are either losing their eyes, losing maybe their hand. We'll see what happens, and so on. Then we have two parts. Then in this lecture, first, what are the risks identified? Second, what are the mechanisms the society manage to avoid them or to mitigate, and so on. For the purpose of this lecture, I will focus on three categories of martial arts. Then on the upper part, tournament or jousting, which is the main one, the most famous, the one for the nobility, but not only some burghers do some tournaments at the end of the medieval times. And in that kind of tournament, the danger is inherent of the activity. If no danger, nobody will do that, or at least at the beginning of the 12th century. And on the second, below, you have what we are focusing today. It's fencing. What are the risks that appear during fencing? You have exactly what I told you, a cut to the forearm, And then the third category of martial arts considered today is the shooting one. I was obliged to go broader, to focus on this large scale of activities to have enough kind of situations. Only one of these activities not enough to address every way they manage risks. And secondly, for the area, I will address also the risk considered in Western Europe and a large scale France, France, Germany, a bit of England and other countries. But this is something with a broad area. Otherwise, I couldn't have enough data to make the discussion possible. Then, what are the identified risks? The physics in jousting. The first risk people occurred is the death, and actually in the 12th century and probably end of the 11th century, the tournament were done in open fields. You try to capture other team. You are working with spear and sharp spear, sharp swords, and this is really dangerous, and this is something to prepare you for the war. And then the main risk, as I told you, is by death. You could also fall from the horse, and you could, probably people could not figure it, but one of the identified risks is by managing horse to have the knee damage that make you unable to participate to the tournament. This is something that happens in the 15th century. And a lot of people, when you carry your horse, then your horse start to move a lot and kick your leg. And then managing horse then provide you risks, and you either even in the 15th century when they were using unsharp material or some material that protects a little bit better the body. You could have people who received enough injuries that oblige the organizer to cancel a day of tournament because there was not enough people to participate. And then you could imagine then, this is one of the few examples of things that prove that injuries are inside the activity of practicing, and you have then many mentions of death or big injuries at that time, not to mention the King of France again. In shooting contest, then shooting is very popular in medieval times. It's one of the few martial arts that have been then the city or the kings asked people, tried people to train themselves by shooting by bow, shooting with a crossbow, shooting with gun. And then you see a few examples of risks that have been identified by the society. The first one, probably you don't have it in mind, but yes, shooting with a shotgun inside the city could make the woman abort. And then please shoot outside for that reason. So probably not the main one, but you see, this is one of the kind of the risk identified by the society in 15th century Strasbourg. The main risk besides this one is the stray arrows. And any stray arrows, stray balls, when you are shooting, for instance, to the birds, the papagayo, the shooting with, you see a big spear, you put above a wooden bird, and you shoot, but you shoot from the ground to the top. And you could imagine what could do the arrows and whatever. If you shoot somewhere, anybody who shoots, you never could expect your arrows or get the target. Then you could have people who received your arrows, your ball in the body. That's a pity. And and probably people are not always doing it in a safety way. And you have mentioned, for instance, in Strasbourg, forbidden people shooting at storks, in English, storks? Cigogne, but I don't know the word in English. Stork also. Then please don't shoot at stork in the city. And probably not to protect the bird. And I tell you that there was very difficult. It's very difficult to have statistics, but anyway, an academic guy in England produced statistics about mention of but sport activities in the 16th century, and see that shooting is the deadliest one. The one that above all other sports activities. And again, people are not shooting directly to another guy. Then this is mostly stray arrows. There is sometimes also some curious danger. Then I have mentioned in 16th century Germany, so a guy who have his arquebus on the side, loaded. And I don't know how he could manage, because shooting with arquebus is slow activity. But the shoot starts while walking in the city, and he killed someone who was watching you. Then finally, we are starting the study of the physical injuries that I've been able to find in the fencing activities. And this is a big extract then for you. This is in Valence, then the south of France, maybe 300 kilometers from here. A guy entered into a fencing room where we have the address, or at least the street, which always exists. He enters in it, and by entering the room, he was asked to fight against the assistant of the fencing master. And while fencing together, what is said is the assistant, the provost, raised the sword of his opponent a little bit too high and received his sword in the eyes and then died. And this is a pardon letter, une lettre de rémission en français, in French. Then the guy who killed the other said that, oh, I never expect to do it, any damage and so on. I have a woman and I have kids, and please let me, forbid me. I beg your pardon and so on. And this is then an exact mention of a death that occurred in France with this kind of example, but it is not the only one. Then I have very few mentions of hand injuries. The first one is not a real one, but this is something which appears in a pedagogical book, How to Learn French for English People. Yes, end of the 14th century. And he mentions that he received, doing fencing, large bruise on the right hand that split it up and it opens the bone. Then you could imagine that he mentions that it breaks the bone. But this is at least something to learn language, but you could imagine that such kind of things can happen. And 14th century, 1040. Well, sorry. Thank you. Mention of light wounds happens also in a sport contest in Sordon-Beclin, and then people start to become a little bit angry about that, and so on. Things go to the death of someone. But it's very rare to have this kind of mention of injuries in hand, actually. Most of them are, probably people don't die while doing fencing by having the hand damage. There is most of the mentions, as I told you, is the death. And for instance, as early also in the same period, Sword Buckler in Normandy, a player was hit in the face by the sword of his opponent, and it led him to death. It is not the eyes actually, but it's probably a shock to the forehead. A few years later, always in Normandy, and you have a fight against someone who, as it was written, and while playing the said Géant Coquet, who had been drinking, or drunk, could consider both, in wanting to eat the said Adam, and obtain victory over him about at the 200th sword, approached the said Adam, and with the sword of the said Adam, which was on his gourd, was hit on the right eye, from which he fell onto the ground and died a few days later. Injury in the forehead appears always also in the Sword Buckler, the same period. 16th century, north of France, at that time it was the Flanders, Valenciennes, strike given with a rebated sword. It was mentioned that this is a sword which is unsharp. I will discuss this later. It was struck on the forehead, and that led this to the brawl. He doesn't die about that, but he was angry, and then the brawl followed. After the brawl, there was someone who died. Otherwise, nobody speak about that. And finally, in the Fechtschule in Germany, I have at least 4 mentions of 3 mentions of eyes which are perforated by different kind of weapons: Dussac, staff, rapier, many, and even in 1590, a strike has been done in Nuremberg, a thrust to the forehead that broke the head, and apparently, if I could trust the text, it opens it up to the brain. That's life. Very controlled it, probably. Yeah, Nevers techniques. Finally, a second kind of risk that have been considered at that time, and probably not the one you could figure it, it's very important that for many theologians between the 12th and the 13th century, the participant in tournament commit some of all the 7 deadly sins at the same time by participating to the tournament. Then they did participate to the tournament at the peril of their soul. And it's much more important than they dying by accident. And well, this is a little bit, how to say that, tricky, probably a little bit out-considered, but whatever. Then they give it the reason why they consider it they are doing the 7 deadly sins. Then the wrath, because they are involved in fighting against others, envy because of those who fight better than oneself, and so on. Could have, and even you see, I have lust. Yes, lust for the woman after the tournament. Then participating to the tournament is not something that you should do. Otherwise, you could have some trouble with, you see, the life after death. And there is also some example of peril of the soul for fencing, for instance. They were mentioned in Geneva, but not only Geneva. I have many mentioned in France too, and that practicing fencing could people avoid to go to the mess and following the religious celebrations. Then it's also done and could lead you to the peril of your soul. It's also in Geneva, for example, in 1560, people who fencing master was expelled, put away the city because he practiced fencing and get in his lessons young boys who then do not follow religious learning, catechism. I don't know in English, catechism. And in a city where Calvin was at that time, it was very something terrible, and there was a lot of mentions of forbidding people from forbidding the practice of fencing during the religious ceremony. Then this is all for the identified risk, either for the soul or for the body. But there is enough, at least, to see. You see, it could be done by accident. This is martial arts. This is I don't mention here anything about whatever could happen really in a brawl. I only take situations that appears in something which is a leisure activity. I don't mention too the trouble that could happen to anybody watching to the sport, except I see the guy who was shot with the shotgun. But you have many people who could be, while people are wrestling, you could fall on people watching you and you could kill them. So, could kill the kid and so on. I have mentioned of people doing that by just a catch game. Then I have nothing in mind for the martial arts activity, but it probably could be fine too. Then what are the mitigation or prevention of the risk that have been identified? Then in shooting contest, for instance, the first category of the first way to manage the risk is to accept it. But it's exactly what we do actually nowadays in society. What are the risks? Okay, could we accept, or should we do something? Then, to accept it, for instance, Maximilian said if someone passed inside the shooting line during a shooting contest, if he received any arrows or any, it's not the organizer's fault. It's the guy, if he died, whatever, it's his fault. He shouldn't. Then they accept, he don't have to pass in. And you see, even the emperor wrote something about that, and it's probably something that happens. And this is a good way to avoid to manage the risk. In fencing, for instance, you have another way to accept the risk, and this is one of the main targets at that time was the highest part of the body, which is the head. The unprotected head, which is a good target to be looked at during fencing. And this is, you should just forbid to hit the head. But no, this is something that have been looked for in England, in France, in Germany. And they accept the risks that something wrong could happen to you by being struck on the head, and I show you that it happens. And finally, in tournament of justice, I mentioned the theologian that asked for the petition for forbidding tournament, but the society finally changed their mind and considered that, oh yes, justing is good for instance, preparing people going to the crusade, for instance. Then, okay, probably there are probably some sins, but this is also for a good cause. And then they accept the risk on the soul. But also, for instance, you see, manage it by, when in the 13th century, you was forbidden to be buried on the Christian earth if you died in a tournament. Okay, then you find a priest near your families that accept to do it, whatever. And then you could expect to revive. It is very important for them. The real life is just a small part in your complete life. Most of it in their conception is after death. Then this is risk, the acceptation of risk. The second one is to forbid. Okay. And they forbid, for example, to fence while being drunk. They forbid to fence with a sharp sword on your side. because if you are hungry, whatever, you could draw it and it could finish badly. And there is mention you see in Strasbourg or in Lille, but I probably there is really something that could happen in many regulation texts. And for another case, for instance, in the middle of France, Issoudun, where is the city council asked they forbid for anybody that to enter a fencing room with your personal weapon on you. Then you could also, I also already mentioned it, that to avoid people going to the fencing room or fencing room, the salle d'armes or doing any game, it is forbidden to do it, to open the room to practice it during the religious ceremony. This is then in France by royal ordinance, or they probably also go broader and they forbid to do anything of that kind on a Sunday. Then no problem then, no activity of that kind on the Sunday. And to avoid also you could have the preacher could be annoyed by drums and pipes that have been used during the fencing activities, and this is also forbidden to organize anything during the preach, just to avoid to it. And anyway, and then there is some other prohibitions that have been here, including it's forbidden to kill the opponent's horse. The third one, so some way to organize, to manage risk is to organize a space where people are practicing. This is really important for fencing, for instance, and this fencing on armor fighting. They put delimitation between people. And you have something that happens at the end, appears at the end of the 15th century that is called combat de barrière, barrier fight, which start to become really popular, big trend up to the 17th century. Below, it's from Jacques Callot, 1610 or 1615, and with a lot of dance, a lot of ceremony around, and people are striking on each other in armor with nothing below the belt, because there is you see the barrier in between, and you strike from above the barriers, and no wrestling, no catch, and so on. Then you put people like in volleyball, you see, like in beach volley, and obliging people, forbidding people to go in direct contact that could follow in armor, for instance, to the major risk we could imagine. This delimitation of the playing field happens also in shooting. They oblige people shooting contests to be sit outside the city. Then you have the 3 arrows could go somewhere, but apparently not in the body of people. But it happens anyway. And I have an example in a German city where they put the Schießreihen, the park where people are shooting, you see a loop on the river, but there is boat on the river. Then they put a wall at the top, and even in a second time they get the wall higher to avoid arrows or to put risk on people who travel on the river. And so this is a way to organizing space. And finally, in fencing, there was very few mention of the dedicated space for the fencing alone, but you have a lot of mentions of barrier around the people. And the pictures of fencing, I don't know if it is big enough, but as you see, there is the activities that took place inside the barrier. This is what is called Fechthaus in Nuremberg, but this is a place which is not dedicated to fencing alone. And a lot of, it is also called Schauplatz. Then a lot of activities took place in it. And for the fencing, they put specific barriers to separate public from the fencers. Then another way to manage the risk is to adapt the equipment. First, the personal protective equipment, which is nowadays name we could give it, exists. For instance, in fencing, you have padded gloves that appears in the end of the 16th and 17th century. You have padded gloves, padded forearms. And the fencing masks are, as you know, nearly missing. No fencing mask. The first fencing mask is probably at the end of the 16th century, but it's barely not used before this 19th century, or even in 19th century, most of the people are fencing without mask. And it's nearly in early 20th century that becomes much more popular. In armor fencing, the armor have been, armor and jousting tournament, you specialize the armor for your activity, you do it. You put larger plate of armor in front of you to provide being stabbed through the armor. You have specific armors that have no possibility to reduce the mobility of your body because you don't need it. You just need to put your forearm below with the spear and so on. Then you adapt the equipment to protect yourself against what the major risks that happens against you. You could also modify the cell. Thank you. The sandal. You can modify the sandal to avoid you to be thrown away and then to be blocked on your horse. And you add additional protection for the horse, and so on. And you can also modify the weapon. And for instance, I mentioned the rebaited sword, and actually this is the word in English, in the medieval world. The rebaited sword is a very common word you can find for fencing sword. In France, this is épée rabattue, épée battue. This is the standard one. This is probably the way they deal with not an unsharp, but a blunt weapon. And in Germany they call it Fechtschwert. Federschwert is a modern name. You couldn't find any mention of Federschwert in the 16th century Germany. Or Paradschwert or Fechtschwert. But there are anyway dedicated stuff, dedicated tool for the practice of fencing, and then to protect people. And finally, in the 16th century, with the apparition of what they call rapier in Germany and England, or Épée, the thin one, they put, in German it was named Knopf, in French Estoff, or button, and probably fleuret, it's probably the name fleuret came from this round tip you put above the blade and look like a ferrule button. But most of the depth or the eye touch in fencing I found was with the rapier. Anyway, I see with the long sword you have something very large. If you look at the real Fechtschwert, the top part, the tip of the sword is very large, then probably to avoid any danger to the eye. Whereas in rapier, you couldn't have a round part that is big enough to protect the eye. That's the trouble. Finally, one of the ways to mitigate the risk is to modify the way you practice. And you modify by tightening the rule. And for instance, in barrier combat, at the first time you could grab your opponent. Then, okay, rules are modified. It's forbidden to catch above the barrier your opponent and put it and carry it on you. And it's also forbidden to thrust with the sword. You can only thrust only with spear. In fencing, it's very, many people knows it. In Germany, but also in France, the thrusts are forbidden in the longsword, simply. Then it's also probably why I found very few mentions of death in Germany in Festschwingen in longsword. Whereas in Dussac or staff or rapier, you continue to thrust. And if you look at the few rules we could find in Germany, you have no wrestling, it's forbidden also to throw stones, but well, to kick on the groin. You have areas that could be avoided. In France, for instance, and we'll see that tomorrow, it's forbidden to hit the forearm, the hand, or below the belt, only of the upper part of the body. Then to limit the area makes you much more able to protect yourself, probably also. And then that's it. And another way is also to addicting or to create different kind of games. For instance, in tournament, whereas at the beginning it was only the team fight, then you forbid in team. In 15th century, you could have also a big group mass combat, but only with mace or swords, on large swords, but no spear at all. And the spear only was used in 1 against 1 in the joust. Then you limit by the rule set, you limit the game, and then you could manage much more easily the risk inside the practice. And if you look at the 16th century joust in Germany, there was maybe 4 to 5 kind of different jousts. I wasn't unable to understand exactly the difference between them. You have Rennen, station, and and there are more difference for each kind of game. There are more for you, there are more for the horse also. And finally, in wrestling, it is in Pietro Monte. Pietro Monte mentions that there was a large variety of rule set that happens in different kind of area in Europe. For instance, in England, you fight with a piece of not clothes, but in fabric. Thank you. A piece of fabric around the neck. And you fight with managing the neck by that way. This is something that have been found in manuscript in the 14th century and mentioned also in Pietromonte. In some other countries, it is said that you are not it's forbidden to put the hand on the ground, and then you lose. The only thing you can put on the ground is your knee. Then it limits the possibility of what you could do. If you look also at the wrestling in Ireland, well, that's it, in Ecosse, Scotland. And then you have you are obliged to wrestle with both hands tight, your two hands connected together, and you lose as long as one of the two hands are separated. This kind of rule limit the game and limit the risks. And that's it. Then finally, as you have been able to see, the society identified some kind of risk, take many kind of way to avoid, to limit, or to accept it, and to make finally, there is, except for the tournament, and in the 13th century, there was no prohibitions of this kind of game, despite the evidence of the risk that appears. And it is deeply, this is something which is very, you could imagine with the quality of the medicine at that time, being injured on the head, on the eye, having the hand broken, is something that you should avoid. And something that could strike our mind too, it's in fencing, people are only light glove at maximum. And then they were able to manage and to develop a kind of way to practice without endangering something which is very crucial for them to work. And this is probably something which is at least difficult to imagine, because at that time, 16th century, they could have padded gloves, but no one appeared. Then this is a different way to manage the risk, and actually another way to see this problem is to consider that the society is not always very could focus on something which is not that important. And but for them, it looks like. And I'll give an example in modern time in baseball, early 20th century. The first protection, the guy, you see there is the guy with the club, and a guy behind will catch the ball. But then you receive a ball with approximately 100 kilometer per hour speed, something very fast. They get directly on them. What is the first protection they had? The groin. Then the facial protection appears later. Then that will be my conclusion today. Thank you. Is there any questions?
Do we know from where comes the word feather?
The modern one, we probably should dig into internet archives, but probably it happens early into maybe in 2010. This is the first time I see it, but no.
I did understand you think that takes a head of as target, unprotected head as target is very dangerous. Why?
Yeah. I know. Okay, I get your point. This is very dangerous for when the eyes, for instance, I give the example of stroke given to the head that have been followed by a death of the guy. One of the ways to avoid that is to forbid thrust in the face.
Yes, but we have at the same time we have no thrust. This one. The second is, do you have counts about pleasures in this time in tournament or training? For example, at the Hall of Myers, where the head was obviously. Because that's why I want to ask, because I have some experience on this. We work much time and target head. Yes, we take the mask, but what I was observing is that it is very easy or easier to control a hit when you have the target fixed on the head than to control it when you give it on every part of the body. It's one. The second is when you tell the guys, okay, but now you give the hit to the head, they have another intention to hit, because they think if they hit too hard, they will hurt, they will bless the friend, and they think it's the same way it was working at this time. So because we have for Meyer, we know he had also license for alcohol and so I think there was, after the training, there was good drinking, and so I don't want to hit someone hardly who is a friend and to whom I will drink after the training. So this will be a rule which can manage to learn to control hits.
Exactly. This is a paradoxical way. You eat something which is very critical for your life, which is the head, for most of people, with a heavy sword. I mean, it is not a light stick, but as it is a target which is something critical, you will be obliged then to control. For social reason, for personal, you don't expect to kill your partner, even for winning money. Then this is paradoxical. You eat something which is dangerous, but it obliges you to control. Exactly. This is you're right.
I remember that French shut down from, I don't remember when, there was also a fine if you were to bruise the head or bleed or make your partner bleed. So that would be also very an incentive not to hurt your adversary.
Exactly, you have also the same thing in the 16th century. I don't mention, but it's forbidden in France to make to give breeze in France to faire rose, than to give something that happens the blood, even if it is not just appearing below the skin.
Have you found evidence during your search on the pride of bearing scars?
No, but not at that time. It is not mentioned. It exists, but later. Maybe it could have some kind of prod of, but I have no evidence on that.
Yes, they were technically able to make some clothes, some protective gear. They just didn't wear it because, okay, well, I have scars. Look, I am an experienced fighter.
This is clearly the case in the 19th century, for instance, in Mansour, but from the 13th to the 16th century, I have nothing. Nobody that, nothing to prove the contrary, and no evidence. Rémi?
You talk about accident that lead into death, because there are death records, I guess, but do we have any idea of injury rates? Broken fingers and stuff like this must have been quite common, I guess.
But yes, probably that we could imagine, but I have no evidence. There is no record of that kind. I mentioned two of them, you see, but this is nothing. One is in literature, and another one is during a fight. He received a lot of small bleeding wound on the forearm, but that's all. There are probably much more the physical risk. As I mentioned, the knee broken by the horse. You have probably also in wrestling some kind of troubles, but as there is no death, you are not obliged to ask for your pardon and to be reintegrated into the society. And you need to pay something as a counterpart, but there is no written, nothing written about that.
Do we have any information about the speed at which fencers would play and the strength of the blows they will exchange?
Well, nothing you see, nothing in the source that could give you any detail about this kind of things. The concept of time, of speed, the way you see it is even missing in the fencing treatise in the 16th century. The concept of time, it's something that happens a little bit later. And probably also the ability to develop arguments on that point is probably not, they probably don't have the tool, intellectual tool to express it, or at least there is no mention. No, I never seen mention that you ask people to strike slowly, for instance.
What do you think? Don't you think that the speed we use today is much higher than the speed they use at the time of Maya, for example? That I think if you work without protection, you can't go with the speed we do today.
I'm not completely agree with you, but the way you fence change a lot. There is some experiment by people without protection and without injuries. For instance, I grew up around Peter Turian in Czech, and also in Bruges. They practice it, and it could be quite fast. But you have always in mind that your hands are unprotected, and you maintain contact much more longer than we did. Actually, the difficult thing is what's probably changed is the speed of your move speed, going outside and inside the fight and going very fast. You are unable to protect yourself, unable to control correctly, and it's probably much more less move. But I directly observe people being able to go very fast in leisure fencing without with long swords and without protection. And even a young lady has seen one 1 month ago. Then it's possible, but it requires a lot of training in such kind of activity.
Maybe one question about the confidence we got with the number of deaths recorded. My question, is this something more related as a regulation or laws to collect every evidence of death occurring in a sports event? Or is this something more linked to the practice itself, like in archery or in jousts? They have the ability to collect this?
No, there is no use to collect the death records for that point. One of the main archive documents managed that I use were either the regulation text that forbids and put rules, but also the pardon letter. When people produce the death of someone during game, and then you could have then the context of when the death appears, and this is where you could have detail on this kind of detail. And otherwise, also in Germany, it seems this is a kind of literature that is called well, I forget the name, but this is a poem where you are very sorry that someone died, and you have some mention of this kind of poem where they describe the death of someone killed in Feschrun. Then you have some kind of documents, but which oblige us to focus then mostly on death experience, for death experience. Andreas?
I have one question, but it's maybe too complex. When you take risks, it's because you have a reward. Are there any mentions of, other than getting prizes, but of social rewards of being good at fencing that could motivate you to take the risk of getting hurt?
This is really clear. The best example is in tournament. Actually, it's very important for you to show your bravery by getting in danger during the joust, and it is really important. And an example is probably in a marriage, wedding in the end of the 16th century, a duke in Germany, the son of a duke, who fight in armor with sharp weapon against someone to prove that his blood is very strong. Whatever, he was in armor, and they have maybe 7 or 10 stroke maximum. Then the risk is very limited, but it is very important in that society to prove that you are man for that. This is something that is, yes, clear, very clear.
In the same sense as what I said, I remember that Pierre-Alexandre Chaise told me about a Feschkuhle, Tussac Feschkuhle that goes on 2 days. There was a very big money prize, and the second day had to be cancelled because by the end of the first day they were all bruised on the head and the face and the arms.
This is a good one. It was in wood. No, but
Same thing in England with the stick fighting, the bloody head.
I don't have in mind this example, but yes, I don't pretend that my study was exhaustive. Another question? Another one? Finished. Thank you for forbid. I manage with my English.